A couple of weeks ago, I was streaming the game Pokémon Conquest, and someone in chat asked me who I thought the signature Pokémon of all the Three Houses Lords were. I thought this was a pretty interesting question, so I decided to expand it into an entire video and cover every Lord in the franchise. So that's what this video is. First up is Marth, the Pantsless Prince. And I decided I wanted to reference the fact that in Fire Emblem 1, enemies prefer to target Marth over anyone else, including if they have kills on your non-Marth units. So I looked through the list of Pokemon who could learn redirecting moves like Follow Me and Rage Powder, and one stuck out as very Marth-esque. That being the Pokemon Clefable. This Pokemon has a long history of punching well above its weight class thanks to a good move pool and typing. And I feel like that mirrors Marth's status as a high-tier unit in the old Arcanea games, despite being foot-locked and sword-locked, as well as lacking a promotion. For the Lords of Valentia, Alm and Celica, I wanted to have two Pokemon with some sort of relationship to each other, since I feel like the thing that most strongly defines Alm and Celica is how they play off of each other. Alm is more focused on fighting, and he is the warrior of the duo. Meanwhile, Celica is the priest, and is more interested in the spiritual and healing aspect of the Lord's duty. Within typings, this dichotomy feels reflective of the fighting and fairy types, which is why I decided to assign them Gallade and Gardevoir. This split evolution tree covers both the physical and special sides of the spectrum, and Gardevoir being more female-coded while Gallade is more male-coded, and in fact is locked to male Pokemon, aligns perfectly with the duo of lovers from Valentia. Heck, Gardevoir uses magic, whereas Gallade focuses on blades, which is Alm's weapon of choice. Well, swords, I guess, technically. I'm not going to be linking every pair of Lords, though, cause Sigurd and Seliph I feel are different enough that I'm assigning them different Pokemon. Initially, I looked towards the various horse Pokemon for Sigurd because, he rides a horse, but Rapidash, Mudsdale, etc. didn't seem to fit his vibe. So I tried to think about what other characteristics of Sigurd are so iconic, and the one that came to mind was just how strong he is. He joins you at the beginning of the game and stomps through the entire first generation with almost no need for assistance. And while that could justify mapping him onto an overpowered Pokemon like Mega Rayquaza or Mewtwo, but I personally feel like the Mudkip line is a better fit, because it similarly joins you at the very beginning of the journey and stomps through the entire campaign with no issues. Aside from their dominance, these two don't have much in common, but they're both such iconic campaign-long powerhouses that I felt like it was appropriate. Arguably, Infernape could fill a similar role because it is also an incredibly unbalanced starter choice, but I think it needs a little bit more help in the Sinnoh campaign than Mudkip does in Hoenn, which is why I decided to give Sigurd the Mudfish Pokemon. As for Sigurd's son, he's a lot less overpowered than his father, and in fact requires quite a bit of favoritism and a horse before he can become good. Well, I can think of a Pokemon who becomes good upon getting a horse. And that, of course, is Calyrex. What, you didn't think I would make a Pokemon video without a reference to Ice Rider? But even though he's a meme on the channel, I do think that Calyrex, whether it's Ice Rider or Shadow Rider, is a fitting Pokemon to represent Seliph. Meanwhile, for Prince Leif, I struggled to think of an appropriate representation. There's a lot of cool mechanics in Thracia, and I kind of wanted to tie into one of those, but it's not like the follow-up critical coefficient or movement stars are something that maps cleanly onto Pokemon. So I came up with two possible options, neither of which I'm super happy with, but both of which have at least a little bit of logic behind them. My first pick is Tatsugiri, to represent the rescue system which debuted in Thracia 776. Tatsugiri's commander ability jumping inside of Dondozo feels kind of similar to the rescue system, although since it powers up Dondozo instead of lowering Dondozo's stats, you could say that it's more comparable to Pair Up. Which is why I'm not super thrilled about that pairing and instead lean more towards my second choice, Dugtrio, who has the trapping ability Arena Trap. I think that this is the closest Pokemon has to a capture mechanic, Sure, it doesn't involve stealing items from the opponent, but it does involve trapping them. You know, you sort of capture them in the arena. It's a stretch, but I can't think of anything that really fits Leif more. If you can, please let me know, and that goes for any of these lords, by the way. This is all very subjective and vibes-based, so if you have a different list, or even just a specific lord you would assign a different Pokemon to, I would love to hear it. And while you're down there in the comment section, if you liked the video, I would appreciate like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. I know it's annoying when YouTubers ask for this, but it does genuinely help improve numbers. But speaking of improving numbers, Roy is a lord who I most associate with the improving of accuracy, both through his fire support offered to a number of very strong units, and through the fact that his signature weapon, the rapier, is incredibly accurate for chip damage. Combat alone isn't really his strong suit, but the increased accuracy does parallel to another Pokemon who's not super good at combat either. Hydrapple, from the most recent DLC, the Indigo Disc. I'm basing this almost entirely on the ability Super Sweet Syrup, which reduces evasiveness when Hydrapple switches in. Sure, it's not the only way to improve accuracy in Pokemon. Gravity can improve accuracy for everyone on the field, and No Guard means that your attacks will never miss, but Super Sweet Syrup reduces evasion and therefore boosts the accuracy for your allies, and that felt akin to the fire support system from Roy. Besides, Roy has a very good chance of being half-dragon canonically, since Ninian is one of the possible mothers for him, so giving him a dragon-type Pokemon just felt appropriate. Speaking of Roy's parentage, however, Eliwood is another one that I struggled with a lot. I just couldn't think of any Pokemon that aligned with Eliwood's limited personality traits. So I decided to go a little bit meta. Fire Emblem 7 was the first Pokemon game brought to international audiences. And because of his role in both gameplay and story, Eliwood kind of feels like the Western version of the much more iconic and popular Marth. Much like Marth is Fire Emblem's mascot, Pikachu is Pokemon's mascot. And Unova was the first Pokemon setting not to be based on a Japanese region. As a result of that, it seems kind of fitting to give Emolga, the Unovan Pikachu equivalent, to Eliwood, the international equivalent of Marth. There is also kind of the parallel that electric flying should theoretically be better than pure electric, but Emolga feels more disappointing, in a similar vein to getting a horse theoretically being better than an infantry unit, but Marth is definitely better than Eliwood. So there's a little bit of connective tissue there, but if I'm being honest, this is not my finest work. Although I am pretty happy with the Pokemon that I gave to Lyn, even if it is an incredibly obvious one. Lyn's main thing is focusing on speed, and there is a Pokemon that focuses on the speed stat above everything else. Regieleki. I mean, sure, Regieleki is able to do more damage than Lyn typically can, but that's only if we limit ourselves to the main games. In things like Fire Emblem Heroes and Fire Emblem Engage, Lyn is incredibly powerful, in part due to her popularity, so I think it's still a fitting representative. Although, ironically, that means that the only one of Fire Emblem 7's lords that isn't represented by an electric Pokemon is the one with the Thunder affinity, Hector. And much like Leif, I have two potential options for him. Although this wasn't because I couldn't think of any, but because I liked both of these Pokemon choices equally. The first is Axew, and while on the surface this might seem like I just gave the Axe Pokemon to the Axe Lord, it does go deeper than that. As a pseudo-legendary in Unova, Axew's evolution comes super late. And anyone who's played Hector Hard Mode of Fire Emblem 7 can tell you the same applies to the Prince of Ostia. Okay, editing Denny here, he's not actually the pseudo-legendary, but I always get confused between him and Hydreigon. So sorry about that, Poke nerds. As it turns out, the only reason for Axew's late evolution is Unova doesn't know how to make a level curve. But Axew also seems to have been affected by the Curse of Armads. You see, because Hector used the Cursed Axe, he was doomed to die painfully in battle, And this happened in Fire Emblem 6, which is chronologically the next game after 7, where he immediately gets destroyed by Zephyl. Likewise, Haxorus used to be the king, but then in the very next game, which is Pokemon 6, fairy types were introduced, and suddenly that pure dragon typing isn't so impressive. The other one is Tinkaton, and yes, this is another Pokemon wielding an axe, specifically a hammer, which deals effective damage against armors, much like the Wolfbale. But that's not the only connection between her and Hector. Tinkaton's move Gigaton Hammer seems like it should be incredibly strong, but it's held back by its user's abysmal offense stats. Likewise, Hector seems like he should be incredibly tanky, but his abysmal HP stat prevents that from becoming a reality. And Hector's propensity for picking fights instead of asking questions is very Tinkaton-esque. Like, I can totally see the Pink Hammer Fiend filling Hector's role in the cutscenes of Chapter 12. It's more vibes-based than anything, but hey, that's just kind of how this video is. And on that topic, the next Lord Eirika is another very vibes-based pick on my part. I don't know how to explain it, but Eirika feels like the sort of player who would have an Ampharos. The closest logical connection I can come up with is Eirika is defined by how much she cares about her people, and Ampharos in Gold and Silver is lighting the lighthouse, which is an act of service. You could also argue that Ampharos' Mega Evolution doesn't save it in the same way that Eirika's mount doesn't save her, but at the end of the day, I'm not basing this on any sort of logic. It's just how it feels. I don't really know what to say beyond that. Eirika feels like an Ampharos, and good for her. My pick for her twin brother Ephraim is also pretty vibes-based, specifically Phalanx. Phalanx has the no retreat signature move, which does feel kind of analogous to the cutscene in Chapter 5X where Ephraim doesn't retreat because he knows he can win the fight in the castle, but beyond that, it's really just him putting off Phalanx vibes. Again, I don't know how to explain it, he just seems pretty Phalanx coded. I don't know if that's a more or less satisfying reason than basing it off of a single cutscene, but it's probably more satisfying than the choice I made for Ike, because I'm assigning him his Pokemon purely based off of a victory quote from Super Smash Bros. I fight for my friends. Yeah, that's not even from the Fire Emblem games, but it's probably the most iconic thing about him since its memehood status reached a mainstream audience. Technically, all Pokemon fight for their friends because, you know, they're partner Pokemon and their trainers are their friends, but I think there's one whose Pokedex entry goes above and beyond when it comes to protecting their friends. And that, of course, is Drampa, who famously has a Pokedex entry in Sun about how if a child gets bullied, Drampa will burn down the bully's house. Which feels a little extreme, like, I don't know, did Jack and Jill really deserve to have their entire lives ruined just because their second grader son was a little bit of a shit? But it is hard to deny that that is fighting for your friends. Taking the fight a little bit too far? Sure, but Drampa fights for his friends, so he's Ike's signature Pokemon. Now, if you watched my Lords video, you know that I don't consider Elincia to be a Lord. I just don't find the gameplay or story arguments to be convincing. But I know a lot of other people do, so I decided to give her a signature Pokemon as well. Togekiss feels appropriate, because it is a flying fairy type, which is kind of similar to a flying princess, and because in Generation 2 it was an incredibly weak evolutionary line ending with Togetic, which sucked, but then in Generation 4 it got Togekiss, which is actually quite good, sort of mirroring Elincia's transformation from one of the worst units in Path of Radiance to decent in Radiant Dawn. I still think she's kind of overrated, but she's got some good qualities to her, just isn't around that often, unfortunately. And that brings us to the last of the Radiant Dawn Lords, Micaiah, who is more of a utility unit than anything. She uses the power of magic, so I figured either Fairy or Psychic would apply, and when looking for iconic Fairy or Psychic support Pokemon, one in particular comes to mind: Chrysalia. Now, Chrysalia is incredibly tanky, which does not fit Micaiah at all, but having a mostly support-oriented moveset definitely applies. And its signature move, Lunar Dance, is a self-sacrifice move that heals up your allies. Micaiah has the special ability of Sacrifice to heal her allies at the cost of her own HP, so this is pretty close to how Chrysalia functions in Pokemon. Upon returning to Arcanea, we are given the avatar Kris, a self-insert that received so much favoritism from Intelligent Systems, it became a meme within the Fire Emblem community. And Charizard has the same level of favoritism from Game Freak, leading to it having the same meme status in the Pokemon community. So it's a match made in heaven. And that brings us to Awakening, where I gave Chrom a Pokemon for a very similar one-note meme reason. You see, Mousehold will have unprotected sex whether you want it to or not, and the same thing happens with Chrom at the end of Chapter 11. And in fact, who Chrom has unprotected sex with is also something that's not entirely within the player's control. And in particular, forcing him to have sex with Olivia or the unnamed villager is incredibly hard, as oftentimes he would prefer to fuck a dead lady than either of them. Although dealing with Chrom's horny ass is worth it because we get Lucina out of this. And no prizes for guessing that I gave the girl who time travels Seliph as her signature Pokemon. I'm pretty sure I don't even have to explain this one, but in case you were unaware, Seliph is the Pokemon god of time that can travel back in time. And so, yeah, that's Lucina. Next up, we have Robin, who is Awakening's avatar, and has the unique trait of being able to reclass into whatever they desire. This level of flexibility and customizability parallels one of the menaces of competitive Pokemon, Smeargle, whose ability to use every single move makes up for its rather mediocre stats. And hey, Robin's growths, at least by Awakening standards, are actually quite mediocre, but Robin rises to meteoric levels thanks in part to its infinite reclassing. Although Robin's ability to gain extra experience also helps. Corrin, the next step on the avatar favoritism train, has a lot in common with Kris and Robin. Corrin has a ton of flexibility, kind of like Robin, and a ton of favoritism, kind of like Kris. Although I would say that Corrin is closer to the Kris level of avatar than the Robin one. The main difference is that Corrin can transform into a dragon, which is something Kris cannot do. So I'm giving Corrin the Pokemon Mega Charizard X, because Kris is Charizard, and if Kris transformed into a dragon, then Kris would be Mega Charizard X. Now, you might think it's a little bit weird for me to give Charizard 2 spots on this list when there are over 1,000 Pokemon, but hey, Charizard also gets 2 Mega Evolutions when there are over 1,000 Pokemon, so don't blame me, blame Game Freak. The next Lord is also an avatar, Byleth, and as funny as it would be to give them Mega Charizard Y, I am not that depraved, and there is a Pokemon that actually fits the teach much better. Because Oranguru is a Pokemon based around teaching. Its signature move, Instruct, allows its partner to move an additional time. And this feels similar to Byleth not only from a story perspective, since Byleth is a professor at the Officers Academy, but also a gameplay perspective, where I think the strongest thing about Byleth is how their personal ability improves the experience gain of all of the other units in your army. Sure, Byleth can do good combat on their own, and so can Oranguru if you set up Trick Room. Random battles taught me that much. But the main selling point of this Pokemon is Instruct, and that's a thing that Byleth does too. Next up is Edelgard, and we thought about maybe giving her a fire type for spoiler reasons, or a steel type because she has an Armor Knight PRF class. And ultimately, I did go with a steel type, but it wasn't because this type is a defensive juggernaut, because I gave her Jirachi. For those who are not familiar with DPPOU, one of the big controversial figures of that competitive format is Jirachi. Serene Grace Ironhead is a truly toxic combination that many players want banned, However, the argument as to whether or not complex bans are okay, Jirachi itself should be banned, or Jirachi is necessary for the health of the format is one that gets really toxic really fast. Not unlike the Fire Emblem debates known as Edelgard discourse. Being a steel type to indicate the armored class is just a bonus on top of Jirachi's discourse power. As for Dimitiri, I wanted to give him a Pokemon that really embraced the kill every last one of them mentality. And maybe Tinkaton could be in that way since she's super murderous and loves killing Corviknight, but something about that Steel Fairy menace just didn't feel right from a Dimitiri standpoint. And in fact, I struggled for a very long time to figure out what Pokemon would most closely match Dimitiri, until I got an email from someone claiming to be a close personal friend of his. ffnotaknight@gmail.com told me that the best Pokemon for Dimitiri was Emboar. And who am I to argue with someone who actually knows the man himself? So that's what I'm going to assign Dimitiri. Emboar, the boar Pokemon. Claude, on the other hand, was a very straightforward choice. Claude is known for being an archer, and there's a Pokemon that aligns with that, Decidueye. It also helps that of the three Alolan starters, Decidueye is the one that seems to be shafted the most since its hidden ability is Long Reach, which is kind of just worthless. In a similar vein, Claude kind of got sidelined in the larger story of Fire Emblem Three Houses, so I think Claude and Decidueye would have a lot to talk about. And that brings us to the most recent Fire Emblem Lord, Alear from Fire Emblem Engage. And considering Alear wears jewelry to get a bunch of different powers and is the god of Fire Emblem Engage, there's only one Pokemon that feels appropriate. Arceus is the god of Pokemon, and much like Alear wears rings, Arceus uses its held plate items to change forms and get new powers. The plates aren't as complex as the various emblem rings, but I think it's as close a parallel as we're going to get. But those are just my takes. This is a very subjective topic, so I'm sure others will have their own opinions, and I'd love to hear from you down below. This is a bit of a shorter video than I usually do, but I'm working on some huge projects, so I wanted something to come out in the meantime. The topic was actually voted on by my patrons, so if you liked this, then you have them to thank. And speaking of which, I should probably thank them as well. So thank you, Andu, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Firant, Your Doctor, Guiji, Smaz Ruby, Zychrom, Robin D, Alenby, Hound Dogs, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Mare McLean, Jaden, Reflect, Bethany, Calamity Callie, Thaythom, A Clever Username of Lies, Jackson McMahon, Kevin Hart Claw Pose, Tailored Muffin, Electric Giga, Eirika Ford, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Thick Mulder, Arvis, Cripsy Matthews, Floahay, Falsy Videos, Lyra, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Anna Cabana, Some Trades, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Sardonic Muse, Dysike, Kris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Controlled Aegis, Roman Chromantic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Heistiglop, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Henry Johnson, and Dragonback Lancer. If you want to be able to vote on future videos or just have your names featured in the credits, there is a link to my Patreon below. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem content. With all that being said, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.